The 10 lost tribes went wandering into the desert one day, and they all got lost.
So what happened to the 10 lost tribes? I think that they're lost. Could be they say they might have sighted them in India or China.
I think they're in South America.
Ooh, what about the Rastafarians? They claim to be from the 10 lost tribes.
They're everywhere. But they're in front of us. They're our neighbors. We don't always know. They can be Indians, Ethiopians. They can be Arabs. It could be our next door neighbor. We don't know.
They crossed the Bering Strait, and now they're the Native Americans.
Well, the 10 lost tribes, as the name indicates, were lost. The question is as follows. Why are they called the lost tribes? The Assyrian Emperor Sancherib, in about the 7th century before the Common Era, came and conquered the northern section of Israel. He came to Jerusalem as well, but he was unsuccessful in conquering Jerusalem. And he took the northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes, into exile. But unlike the exile of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin later, where we know where they settled and they retained the Jewish life, what happened to the 10 northern tribes is really not known to us. Whether they assimilated into other nations, there is a theory, which is probably correct, that many of them returned and became absorbed into the tribe of Judah. They returned to the land of Israel and they became absorbed in the tribe of Judah. There's also a famous legend that the 10 tribes exist in a kingdom of their own behind the magical river that is made up of fire and brimstone, and that they can't cross until the time of the Messiah, and we can't cross to them. That was a legend about the river Sambatyon that was very popular in the Jewish world. But in the reality of the matter, the 10 lost tribes as entities were lost. Individual Jews were not lost. The individual Jews either came back, as I mentioned before, and became part of the general structure of Judah and later of the Jewish people, or in many cases they may have assimilated into the nations that they found refuge, that they lived in. And in many cases they may have retained some sort of their Jewish identity as well. There are many crypto-Jews in the world who claim to be descendants of the 10 lost tribes. In fact, there's a theory among certain Englishmen that the English are descendants of the 10 lost tribes. I've heard from Japanese that the Japanese are descendants of the 10 lost. You know, everybody wants to be Jewish but the Jews. But the idea of the 10 lost tribes has remained fascinating throughout all of world history, not just Jewish history. So they're lost, but they're not really lost because their idea and their identity still remains as one of the great puzzles that interest people until today.
It was the right thing because then we weren't captured by the Romans.
I think it was wrong because I don't believe people should be making decisions about taking their own lives.
The mass suicide was wrong. I think they ought to have at least fought to their death.
I think it was right. I think it was right, but I don't know if I'm right.
The mass suicide of Masada, in a situation like that, you know, sometimes you got to take your own life because you don't want to be killed by the enemies.
I think that the mass suicide at Masada was wrong because suicide is never right.
Yeah, I think it was wrong. I think you have to fight to the very end. I mean, there's, I wouldn't want to be a prisoner of war, but you can't, you got to fight to the last battle. You got to fight to the last rock or bullet or whatever they had back then. You just got to fight to the end.
We're known to judge if it's right or wrong, but that is the facts of history.
In the year 73 of the Common Era, 3 years after the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Roman legions of Titus, the Roman general Flavius Silva took Roman legions and proceeded to besiege the last fortress of the Zealots, of the extreme Jewish group that had fought the Romans. And they fortified themselves in King Herod's winter palace on the top of a mountainous cliff in the Negev overlooking the Dead Sea. Matzada. The word Matzada itself is from the word Mitzudav, which means a fortress. And it was impregnable. It was impossible to scale. What Silva did was that he brought Jewish slaves and he built a ramp which would lead up to the top of the mountain and allow him to bring his battering rams and his troops up to the top of the mountain and be able to do battle and destroy the inhabitants of Matzada. The Jews of Matzada were hard-pressed as to what to do because of the fact that they didn't want to kill the Jewish slaves in front of them, their fellow Jews, but on the other hand, if they didn't do it, the ramp would be built. And eventually the ramp was built. And it became apparent to the Jews in Matzada that they would not be able to hold out against this enormous force that Flavia Silva commanded, and that their fate was sealed. According to Josephus and others, Elazar ben Yair, the Jewish commander, the head of the Zealots in Matzada, then decided that the only way out was a mass suicide. Rather than submit to Roman rule, suicide was a preferable course of action. In Jewish history, suicide is never seen as being especially heroic, though there are circumstances when it was allowed halachically rather than, for instance, to become an idol worshiper or a convert or be terribly tortured or abused. But whether Matzada, the people of Matzada, we can't really second guess them easily. But there are mixed reviews as to whether or not their suicide was justified. Maybe it would have been better to go into Roman slavery, as all the Jews practically did, but the Jews were soon redeemed from it and built a Jewish community all over the world. Even in Rome, they built a strong Jewish community, and the Jewish people survived. So perhaps the best thing would have been to surrender and survive as Jews. On the other hand, it certainly was an act of emotional bravery for them to kill their wives and their children and themselves as a symbol of the fact that they were not going to submit to Roman slavery. I think in the long run of history, probably there's more negative view than positive view, though in the heroic annals in the state of Israel, Matzada is always portrayed in a positive view and as a positive thing, as an act of bravery. But sometimes living is a greater act of bravery than dying. And therefore, this is subject to mixed reviews and different opinions.
Were Jews expelled from England?
I mean, the British people are known for like their mannerisms and their being civil. I couldn't imagine what the Jews could have possibly done or how they could have behaved that they would have been expelled.
I've always thought the British and the Jews didn't have such a good rapport.
The Jews were expelled from England because they didn't like our yarmulkes.
Yeah, the Jews were expelled from England because they weren't good Christians, and it's a good thing to search for freedom somewhere else.
In the Middle Ages, when the Crusades took place, one of the ideas of the Crusaders was, why do we have to go all the way to the land of Israel to fight non-Christians when we have so many non-Christians amongst us, the Jews? And therefore, in the First Crusade, the Second Crusade, and the Third Crusade, there were terrible, terrible events of persecution, of Jewish communities being destroyed, and again, of forcible conversions. In 1240, the Jews were expelled from France when Louis IX returned from an unsuccessful crusade. In the beginning of the 13th century, the Jews were expelled from England, again when Richard the Lionhearted returned from a basically unsuccessful crusade. And so to a certain extent they took out the defeat that they suffered at the hands of the Muslims, they took it out on the Jews, who were defenseless and were unable to withstand the armed assault of the government and of the Crusaders. In that time, the blood libels were invented. All of the calumnies regarding Jews that were created in the Middle Ages by the Christian world, and which unfortunately have survived even till today, all of that became part and parcel of society and of the government and of the king. And the simplest solution, therefore, was to get rid of the Jews. Hitler had a solution. He got rid of the Jews by killing them. The solution in the Middle Ages, even though many Jews were killed, but basically the solution in the Middle Ages was exile. The Jews were driven out of Spain, driven out of England, driven out of France. And the Jews were out of England for 500 years. It's only in the 18th century that they began to trickle back. The Sephardic Jews came in first, and they lived unofficially, because the decree was not revoked until the 19th century, till the Jew Bill was passed in the House of Parliament in the late 1800s, middle 1800s. But in the 1700s already, there was a Jewish community. Oliver Cromwell allowed Jews to return when he was in power. But for a period of 500 years, England was what we could say Judenrein. There were no Jews there, and England had a long tradition of anti-Semitism, anti-Jewishness. And even though England has led Europe in terms of democracy, etc., nevertheless that stain has not been completely erased.
The difference between Ashkenazim and Sephardim are light skin and dark skin?
Ashkenazi are American Jews, and Sephardi are everybody else.
The difference between Ashkenazi and Sephardi to me, like the East and the West, like, you know, European versus the Middle East.
The difference between Ashkenazi and Sephardi is the kind of fish they eat on Friday night. Ashkenazi eat gefilte fish, and Sephardis eat spicy Moroccan fish.
There are many differences. The main thing to remember, they all come from the same family, they're all from the same father.
The Sephardic community developed basically from the Jews of North Africa and Spain. There's a tradition that the Jews from the land of Israel that were taken into exile formed the basis for Sephardic Jewry, whereas the Jews of Babylonia formed the basis of the Ashkenazi community. That may be a broad overstatement, but the Jews of Spain and North Africa were the core of the Sephardic community. The Ashkenazi community was very small. It began in the Balkans. Jews that came from Babylonia came to the Balkans, and then from the Balkans it came to the Rhineland. And the centers of Ashkenaz in the 10th and 11th centuries were in the communities of Worms and Mainz and Spires, and then later in the Ile-de-France, in Troyes and in Paris, Orleans. That's where the Ashkenazim lived. It's estimated that in the 12th century there probably were no more than 10,000 Ashkenazim in the world. The Sephardim were much more numerous. But the Ashkenazim, the word Ashkenaz is based upon the Hebrew word that was used for Germany. Ashkenazim moved east. Their basis was Germany. The language they developed, Yiddish, was a colloquial form of Low German, which they Hebraicized and made it their own dialect, their own language. And they continued to move east until they came to Poland and Lithuania, and eventually Russia, Hungary, Romania, Central Europe. And this group, the Ashkenazim, became the most numerous and the most influential group in the Jewish world. In 1939, before the Holocaust, there were about 12 million Ashkenazim in the world, 13 million Ashkenazim. The Sephardim, on the other hand, after the expulsion from Spain, had a difficult time in rebuilding themselves. And they moved all over the Mediterranean basin and into the Near East, Babylonia, Iran, etc. And they had a distinct, what shall I say, Arabic flavor to them, just as the Ashkenazim had a distinct Christian flavor to them, even though the Sephardim were never Arabs and the Ashkenazim were never Christians. But you take on the milieu of the society that you live in, of the country that you live in. And Sephardim also had a language of their own, Ladino, which was a corruption of Spanish and Portuguese and Arabic and Hebrew. And especially the Jews of Turkey always spoke Ladino as their basic language. Turkey, Greece, the Ottoman Empire. The Sephardim had an easier time, quote unquote, in the exile than the Ashkenazim did. The Muslim rule was never kind, but it was much more benign than the Christian rule. And the Sephardim did not undergo the great revolutions of the 19th century that the Ashkenazim did. They didn't undergo the Enlightenment, and they didn't undergo Reform, and they didn't undergo Musar, they didn't undergo the Hasidic movement, and to a great extent they didn't undergo the Holocaust either. And therefore they shaped differently. Their life experiences were different. Today in the land of Israel, we're all lumped together. And part of the process of the redemption here in Israel is that we have to learn how to live with one another, how to reconcile ourselves one to another. And yet at the same time, there's a strong emphasis on each group maintaining its own customs, its own traditions, its own view of life. And that sometimes causes friction, but many times it helps paint a very colorful picture of the Jewish people.
If the Jewish people had never existed, that's a hypothetical that is unanswerable.
I think the world would probably be more like ancient Rome.
You wouldn't have bagels and rocks, you wouldn't have big noses, you wouldn't have banks, you wouldn't have Jewish mother jokes, you wouldn't have Jewish mothers.
There wouldn't be electricity and there wouldn't be knedlach.
We wouldn't have Hebrew National hot dogs and Sandy Koufax.
If the Jewish people had never existed, there'd be no E equals MC squared.
There's a little book, a famous little book called The Gifts of the Jewish People to the World. You know, it's hard to play that game. How would the world look without the Jewish people? But the main gifts, monotheism, the Hebrew Bible, the basis of moral civilization, those things would not be around. And really all of civilization is based upon those things. And then you have the contributions of individual Jews. I'm not talking about the 146 Nobel Prize winners, but the individual Jews over all of the centuries. The oldest medical school in Europe, in Montpellier, in the Provence, in France, was founded by Jews in the 11th century. Advances in every field of endeavor. Economics, science, history, literature. The Jews have been disproportionate. The entire story of the Jewish people is one of being disproportionate. That's why the world thinks that there's so many Jews. And it's hard for them to believe that we are so small in number because of the great influence and great accomplishments that the Jews have made to the cause of civilization. It's also probably true, in my mind at least, that there would be no Islam and there would be no Christianity if there were no Jews either. Jewish people have not existed. And we could probably be looking at a paganistic world, the same type of world that, for instance, exists in Asia until today. A world of idols and all sorts of superstitions that does not have the breadth and the understanding that monotheism brings to culture and to faith and to civilization. So the Jews have made themselves pretty indispensable in certainly in the Western world, in the history of the Western world and of the world generally, by the Torah and also by the individual contributions that Jews have made in every field of endeavor, in every field of human progress, in every field of human knowledge.